Have you ever heard of the saying, taking the soup? Well, if an Irish person says it to you, it tends to be a pretty derogatory thing. Basically, they're inferring that you're compromising on your principles or selling out. And that phrase, taking the soup, actually originates in the Great Hunger, when people supposedly converted from Catholicism to Protestantism in return for a bowl of soup in order to survive, meaning that they took the soup and converted. However, this phenomenon is massively exaggerated. There's very few cases in history of it ever happening. They're isolated and few and far between. But it is part of a much bigger story in the Great Famine, because in one of the darkest years of the Great Hunger, Black 47, the British government would open thousands of soup kitchens across Ireland. Now these would become pretty notorious for many reasons, but in this video I'm going to look at why they opened these soup kitchens, what the soup they served was like, did they save any lives, and then we'll also look at how a French celebrity chef of the time got involved as well. That's a pretty bizarre anecdote to this story, but let's get into that now. Before we continue, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Finn Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian and I also make the Irish History podcast. You'll find a link to that beneath this video. Now this is part of a series of videos that looks at the history of the Great Hunger. I've already covered the years 1845 and 1846 in other videos. I've got a playlist where all those videos are together. You'll find that also beneath this video. But now let's get on to the story of soup kitchens, and a pretty odd story of how a French celebrity chef got involved in what became an absolute PR nightmare. Now it'll come as no surprise to you when I say that the British government handled the opening years of the Great Famine in Ireland pretty disastrously. By December 1846, their actions had led to a catastrophic situation in Ireland where hundreds of thousands of people were starting to die. Their major relief policy was a public works scheme, but that work was too heavy for starving poor people and the wages were too low to feed them, and newspapers were full of stories about how that was a disaster. So in January of 1847, that year known as Black 47, they made a major shift in policy and they announced something called the Temporary Relief Act. Remember that name, the Temporary Relief Act? I'll come back to it later on. But under the terms of this new legislation, the British government announced they were going to open up thousands of soup kitchens all across Ireland to feed the starving poor. Now in Ireland, this was welcomed. People had been asking the British government to directly intervene in the situation in Ireland, but they had refused up until this point, kind of committing themselves to free trade principles where they would intervene in the economy as little as possible. Now this all changed in early 1847, but the British government, as with a lot of policies during the famine, pretty much made a mess of this. So after announcing they were going to open up soup kitchens across Ireland, the British government then basically delayed for months and months and months. So all through the famine, they were convinced that the Irish poor were basically trying to con them out of money. I know it's kind of a blunt way of saying it, but that kind of overrode a lot of their policies and positions in relation to Ireland. So when they announced they're going to open up soup kitchens, they insisted on huge reams of paperwork being filled out before these kitchens could open. So no kitchen opened until March 1847. And in those months between January, when they announced it, and March, when the kitchens started to open, thousands of people were dying every week. And when they opened the soup kitchen, it turned out to be an absolute PR nightmare, so I'm going to look at that next before we look at what happened when the kitchens were up and running. In April 1845, in a kind of a PR launch of this new policy, the British government got on board a French celebrity chef of the time. Now this guy was kind of like an equivalent of Jamie Oliver of his day. His name was Alexis Soyer. He was very popular in London, and British politicians approached him to see if he'd get involved. And Sawyer was kind of taken with the plight of the Irish poor, and he actually devised a recipe for these soup kitchens that was basically cheap, easy to make and nutritious. And he said that if this was given to the poor, it would really help them. And he even actually came to Dublin in April 1847 to launch and roll out this new policy, but it could not have gone worse. So Alexis Soyer designed a model soup kitchen, which he claimed could feed 1,000 people in an hour. And in early April 1847, one of these was erected in front of Collins Barracks in Dublin. You'll know it today, it's a museum in the city. I have it here behind me. But in front of that barracks, they built this model soup kitchen. And naturally, when the poor of Dublin, who had been starving for months at this stage, heard about this soup kitchen, they flocked down to get food. However, when they arrived there, there was the most unbelievable spectacle playing out. So instead of letting the poor into the soup kitchen, the great, the good and the wealthy of Dublin had gathered in the barracks, and they actually paid to watch the spectacle play out of the poor being fed in this soup kitchen. It was pretty perverse, but it got even worse. So before the poor were allowed into the soup kitchen, the rich were basically given a tour of the kitchen to see how it functioned, so the starving poor queuing up had to watch this. Now eventually the kitchen would open, but that move was criticised in Irish newspapers pretty understandably. But now I want to look at what happened after that disastrous launch, because thousands of these kitchens were opened across Ireland, and they did have an impact. So through the late spring and early summer of 1847, thousands of these kitchens would be opened across Ireland, over 2,000 in total. Now the quality of the food being served in these kitchens has been the subject of intense debate over the last 180 years. Certainly in some cases they were serving very poor quality food. Often you'll hear it was like water and vegetables. But we do know it did have a positive impact, because in late 1846 the situation had been absolutely dire. I explained in a previous video how the death rate was running into the hundreds of thousands. However, by July 1847, when around 3 million people were being fed by these soup kitchens, the death rates in Ireland, or something called excess mortality, had returned back close to normal. So it was clear the soup kitchens were having a major effect. Now, if you know about the history of the Great Hunger, though, you know it didn't end in Black 47. It continued into the 1850s. So how, if the British government had finally figured out how to tackle the crisis, why did the famine continue? Well, next I'm going to tell you what the British government did in the late summer of 1847, because this is absolutely unbelievable stuff. Now, these soup kitchens, successful as they were opened under a piece of legislation, as I mentioned earlier, called the Temporary Relief Act. Now, the key word there is temporary, because when the British government opened them in January 1847, or when they passed that legislation and started the process of opening them, they were always adamant that they were going to close them down as soon as possible, because these soup kitchens kind of ran against their thinking on the world in general. As I've already explained, they were committed to free market ideas and believed that they should intervene in society as little as possible. So they were adamant they would close these soup kitchens down as quickly as possible. And in August 1847, they announced that they're going to close down all these soup kitchens. Now, can you imagine what it must have been like in Ireland? You've got 3 million people now being fed in these kitchens, and the death toll is starting to drop dramatically. Things are improving, and then the government say they're going to close down these soup kitchens. But to make matters even worse, there was something kind of happening in the background while these soup kitchens were feeding everyone, and I need to tell you that now, because that will really make you appreciate what an awful decision that was. So while these soup kitchens had been rolled out across the island, over 2,000 of them in total, the situation on the ground in farms and fields across Ireland was actually getting worse. So the potato crop had failed in 1845 and in 1846. And in 1847, people hadn't really planted that many potatoes because they were convinced that the potato crop would fail. Yet again, what was the point? And on top of that, a lot of these people had been working on the disastrous Public Relief Works programme that the British government had launched in 1846. So they hadn't been on their own farms to work the land to sow new crops. So the harvest in 1847, that's Black 47, was tiny. Now, Ireland has to be one of the most unlucky places in the world in the 1840s, because while the blight had devastated the crop in 1845 and 1846, in 1847, when there was only a tiny potato crop planted, the blight didn't really return, or certainly wasn't as bad. So had a crop been planted that year, it may well have rescued the situation. But by the late summer of 1847, the country is more desperate than it had ever been. There's no harvest to speak of going to come in. The economy is creaking on the verge of collapse. And it's at this moment that the British government announced they're going to close down the soup kitchens. They basically, at this point, kind of washed their hands of the famine. A guy I haven't talked about very much in the series so far, a man called Charles Trevelyan, a leading civil servant in Britain who took a lot of these decisions I've talked about. I'm going to make a whole video about him. He would write a book at this point called The Irish Crisis. It was basically about the famine, and that would be published in 1848. And he would refer to the famine in the past tense, as a past event that was over. It wasn't. It was basically, though, that the British government, when they closed down the soup kitchens, washed their hands of the crisis and moved on. On the ground in Ireland, the situation would get so much worse, because now the poor have no help at all. There's no harvest to speak of coming in. The soup kitchens have closed down, and growing numbers of these people start to turn to workhouses in order to survive. Now, in my next video, I'm going to explore the history of these workhouses, because huge numbers of Irish people died inside these institutions. They were the last port of call as the situation got truly desperate. It's an absolutely key part to this history. So in my next video, I'm going to explain that part of the story as we move into late 1847, then we'll also be talking about evictions as well. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that, do leave a comment below. I make videos where I respond to people's comments, and if you've got any questions, hopefully I'll be able to get to them. And finally, I will say thanks very much for watching this video. I really appreciate it.